My name is Tyler. I'm 47 years old, and I'm going to tell you something that happened to me when I was 23. I don't talk about it much, but as winter comes and the snowstorms start hitting around here, my mind always goes back to that night. It was in 1999, when I, my cousin Jared, and two friends, Tom and Eric, decided to spend a weekend at a hunting cabin that belonged to Jared's grandfather. It was located in the middle of a forest in northern Minnesota, isolated from everything and everyone. The plan was simple: enjoy the silence of the forest, drink some beers, play cards, and maybe hunt on Sunday if the weather allowed. When we arrived on Friday afternoon, the place seemed perfect. It was cold, of course, but the sky was still clear, and the cabin, although old, was well maintained. We only had an AM radio that barely picked up any signal, but it was all we needed to feel connected to the outside world. On Saturday night, the weather turned suddenly. The snowstorm started with a strong wind howling through the trees, and within no time the window was completely covered with snow. We couldn't see a thing outside. We were all inside by the fireplace when we heard the first sound. It was knocking on the door, fast and rhythmic. At first we thought it was the wind or a branch hitting, but then it got louder and more insistent. Maybe someone got lost in the storm, Jared asked. He was already getting up to open the door, but Tom grabbed his arm. Wait a second. Who would come out here in the middle of a storm like this? He replied. We all stared at each other in silence while the knocks continued. That's when we heard the first voice. It was a muffled scream, but unmistakable. Tyler, it's me, Dad. Let me in, the voice said. My heart froze instantly. My dad had died 2 years before in a car accident. I was paralyzed, unable to say anything. The strangest part was that no one reacted, until Eric whispered, I heard it too. It sounded like my mom's voice. Eric's mom had passed away last year from cancer. Now it was Jared looking at the door, his eyes wide open, while Tom turned pale like he had seen a ghost. The knocks continued, alternating with the voices. Each one of us heard someone different. Jared heard his grandfather, the owner of the cabin. Tom heard his older brother who had died in a hunting accident. We didn't know what to do. We were terrified, but no one wanted to open the door. It was Eric who suggested that maybe it was some twisted prank from other hunters in the area. This doesn't make sense, I said, finally managing to speak. Who would come out here in the middle of a storm just to play a prank? The idea that it was a prank soon dissipated when the voices started to change. They weren't begging to come in anymore. Now they were calling us by name, saying things only those people could know. My dad mentioned a specific moment that only he and I had lived through, something that happened when I was 10, and I had never told anyone. The same happened to the others. It was impossible to ignore how precise the voices were. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Jared started praying softly, while Tom grabbed the rifle we had brought for hunting. Whatever this is, I'm not opening that door, he said, almost shouting. The radio, which had been silent until then, suddenly started to crackle. A static sound filled the air, and for a few seconds we could hear something like a chorus, overlapping voices, repeating words we couldn't understand. At this point, we were all terrified. We decided to push the table against the door just in case, and we turned off the fireplace to avoid attracting whatever might be out there. The voices and knocks continued for hours, and it seemed like the storm was getting worse. We even discussed whether we should try to leave and seek help, but we knew we wouldn't last long in those conditions. At some point, the voices stopped. The knocks stopped too. We were in the dark, only listening to the sound of the wind. It was Eric who suggested maybe it was all over. Maybe it was just the wind messing with our heads, he said, trying to sound convincing, but no one believed him. We didn't have the courage to check. We stayed awake until dawn, holding flashlights and anything that could be used as a weapon. When daylight finally came and the storm cleared up, we opened the door carefully. There were no signs of footprints in the snow, no marks on the door frame. It was like nothing had happened. But the strangest thing of all was when we realized that the radio was no longer where we had left it. It was outside, buried in the snow, as if someone had taken it out there or something. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. None of us do. After we got back to the city, none of us ever brought it up again. The cabin is still there, but no one in our family has the courage to use it again. I only know that every time I hear the wind during a snowstorm, I feel that same chill running down my spine, as if something or someone is still waiting outside. My name is Lucas, I'm 34 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon. I never imagined I would be writing this account, let alone posting it on an internet forum. But after everything that happened to me and my wife Rachel 8 years ago, I feel compelled to share it. Something so strange and terrifying occurred during our trip to Montana that even today I can't explain it. It was a January morning when we decided to visit some friends in Bozeman. We were excited, but little did we know it would change our lives forever. The weather forecast had warned of snowstorms in the area, but we thought it wouldn't be a big deal. We hit the road without much concern, but soon a snowstorm developed abruptly, practically swallowing us whole. The wind was so strong we could barely see the cars ahead of us. The GPS, already weak in the area, stopped working entirely, and we quickly realized our phones had no signal either. It was as if the road had turned into an abandoned place. The landscape was blanketed with snow, lifeless, empty, just an endless white sheet. We drove blind, guided only by instinct, as there was no other direction to turn. After hours of anguish, we saw an old yellowed sign, worn and barely legible, pointing to a hotel. Oak Hill Inn. It seemed like the only refuge in that storm, so we decided to head there. What awaited us, however, was something we would never forget. When we arrived, there was no sign of life. The building looked massive and oppressive, with an imposing facade that was visibly deteriorated by time. Some windows were broken, others fogged up with snow, and the hotel's name on the sign was partially faded. It looked more like an abandoned structure than a functioning hotel, a relic from a past time. Yet, the sign said open. Rachel hesitated a bit, but the cold was so intense that after a quick look at the road conditions and lack of other options, we agreed to go inside. The worst that could happen, we thought, was that we wouldn't like the place and would leave in the morning. As we pushed open the lobby doors, a peculiar smell, like mildew and old wood, immediately hit us. The hall was enormous, and despite the dust and lack of upkeep, the furniture was still intact. A giant chandelier, its candles half melted, hung precariously from one corner of the ceiling, looking ready to fall apart. The reception desk was empty except for a small golden bell, lightly covered in dust. Rachel glanced at me, and I gave her a nervous smile, trying to reassure her. We both knew the place wasn't normal, but with the storm raging outside, we were too tired to care. So I rang the bell. A response came in the form of a short, thin man emerging from a corridor at the back. He wore a uniform that seemed to be from the early 1900s. His face was pale, and he wore a smile I couldn't quite interpret. It was the kind of smile that seemed more like a mask than a genuine expression. He greeted us in an overly formal tone, but mentioned that the hotel was practically empty, so we could pick any room we wanted. "Make yourselves at home," he said. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. We took the elevator, one of those old-fashioned ones with metal doors. The sound it made as it ascended was almost deafening. The hallway on our floor was even colder. The carpet was worn, the room doors covered in dust, and the numbers on the doors were so faded they were barely legible. When we reached room 304, Rachel hesitated, but eventually agreed to go inside. The room was dark, the window covered in snow, blocking out all daylight. The air was heavy, as if time itself had stopped in that space. I looked at Rachel, noticing she seemed uneasy, but we were so exhausted that we decided to rest for a while. That night, as Rachel quickly fell asleep, I couldn't close my eyes. Something about the room kept me on edge. The silence, the kind of dense, oppressive silence that weighs on you, was deeply unsettling. As I lay there trying to ignore it, I heard something. A noise, distant at first, seemed to come from somewhere down the hallway. I couldn't quite make out what it was, but it sounded like footsteps. Not normal footsteps, though. These were heavier, deliberate, as if someone was walking with purpose. I stayed silent, listening intently. Suddenly, the sound stopped, and I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But moments later, the footsteps resumed, this time closer, as if they were approaching our room. I got up and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, and for a moment I thought about going back to bed and forgetting about it. But then something made me glance toward the end of the corridor. A dark shadow, something moving slowly, as if it had its own rhythm. I couldn't see clearly what it was, but something inside me screamed to shut the door and lock everything. Yet I didn't act immediately. My body was frozen, as if the mere idea of moving was impossible. That thing in the hallway didn't move like a person, it was more like a presence. When I finally managed to return to the room, the sense of unease only grew. I looked at Rachel, and she was deeply asleep, but her face looked strange, as if something was watching her. That made me even more uneasy. The cold seemed to intensify with every passing minute. I couldn't bear it any longer, so I decided to step out of the room. As I entered the hallway, the cold became even more unbearable. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and contort. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I felt as though I was being watched. I decided to go back to the lobby to find the man who had given us the keys, but when I arrived, he was gone. The bell was dusty again, and the entire place felt deserted. It was as if the hotel had reverted to being what it truly was, a place forgotten by time and life. I returned to the room, and Rachel was awake. She looked at me with fear in her eyes and asked if I had felt anything strange. "I can't explain it," I said, trying to sound calm, but my voice wavered. The next morning, the storm seemed to have subsided, but the eerie feeling remained. When we went down to check out, the receptionist was nowhere to be found. We walked to the car, and what I saw next froze me in place. There were no tire tracks in the snow around our vehicle. It was as if the hotel had never really been our refuge. We were caught in something beyond our understanding, and after one last glance back, we drove off without saying a word. For weeks, I tried to research that hotel. I found a strange story. The Oak Hill Inn had been closed after an avalanche killed many of its guests. Since then, no one had stayed there, but somehow, we had. What happened in that hotel remains a mystery to me, and even today, when I think back on the experience, something inside me wonders if, in some way, we're still trapped there. Rachel and I never spoke about it again. We couldn't. The fear was simply too great. What happened in that place defies explanation, but I know it was real. The hotel, the shadows, the strange man, everything lingers in my mind like a scar, and even after so many years, I can't forget. My name is Michael Hayes, I'm 43 years old, and I live in Billings, Montana. I'm about to tell you something that happened to me about 5 years ago, but I still can't forget it. Whenever winter comes and I see the snow covering the ground, I get that shiver down my spine, as if it could all happen again. It happened during one of my trips to my family's hunting cabin, a remote property up in the mountains north of the city. We've had that cabin for decades, but after what I went through, I've never gone back. It was January and a heavy cold front was forecasted, but I thought I'd have time to spend the weekend at the cabin before the storm got worse. I'm an experienced hunter, grew up doing it with my dad and grandfather, so I didn't worry much about the weather. I packed supplies, my rifle, cold weather clothes, and even a portable generator. I arrived Friday afternoon, and everything was as quiet as usual, with snow already beginning to fall. That kind of absolute silence only happens in the middle of the forest in winter. That night, with the fire crackling in the fireplace, everything felt normal. It was only the next day that things started to get strange. On Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of the wind. I looked out the window, and the storm had already gotten worse. Everything was white, and I could barely make out the pine trees around the cabin. I decided it would be safer to stay there until the blizzard passed. I made myself a strong coffee, sat by the fireplace, and tried to relax. But then I noticed something. Every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, it seemed like something moved outside. I couldn't see clearly, just a quick impression, like something was passing between the trees. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me because of the isolation and the constant sound of the wind. But it kept happening, and it got worse. By early afternoon, while I was chopping wood near the door, I heard something. It was faint, almost muffled by the wind, but it sounded like a voice. It sounded like someone calling my name. I dropped the axe, looked around, but saw no one. I thought it was the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me again. But even after I went back inside, I had this feeling of being watched. It was like someone was spying on me from a distance, hidden among the snow-covered pines. That night, things spiraled out of control. I was sitting on the couch with my rifle by my side when I heard footsteps outside. Yes, footsteps. Heavy but slow, as if someone was walking in the snow. I jumped out of the chair, opened the door with my gun in hand, and all I saw was the storm outside. Nothing, no one. But the footsteps continued, circling the cabin. I could hear the sound of snow being crushed. I walked around the cabin with my flashlight, but I didn't find any tracks. That's when I started to really get scared. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to calm myself down, but it wasn't long before I heard the voices again. This time they were clearer. It wasn't just my name. They were words, entire sentences. People crying, begging, help us. They forgot us. We're here. A woman's voice seemed to come from the kitchen, a man's voice from the hallway. And there were others, weaker ones, like a collective murmur that filled the air. It was like the cabin was full of invisible people. I couldn't understand what was happening. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. So I decided to investigate. I went up to the attic, where my grandfather used to keep some old things from the cabin. Among the boxes of tools and hunting gear, I found a small wooden chest. Inside, there were clippings from old newspapers, dated from the 1940s and 1950s. Many of them talked about disappearances in the region, people who vanished during snowstorms, men who went out hunting and never came back, women who got trapped in cabins and disappeared without a trace. There were even photos of some of these people. It was disturbing. When I came back down from the attic, the voices were louder, almost desperate. And then I saw it. At the edge of my vision near the front door, there was a shadow. It wasn't a human figure, but something shapeless, dark, like a smudge on reality. I blinked, and it was gone. I was starting to lose my grip on what was real and what was in my head. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, sitting by the fireplace with my rifle in hand. The voices continued, the footsteps came back, circling the cabin, and I could swear something was trying to get in. But, for some reason, I couldn't sleep. When morning finally came, the storm had eased. I left the cabin as fast as I could, carrying only the essentials, and I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what happened. It was like that cabin was haunted, not by ghosts, but by something much older and deeper, something tied to those people who disappeared in the snow. Since that day, I avoid talking about it. But sometimes, on winter nights, I still hear those voices in my dreams, calling for me. My name is Omar. I'm 42 years old, and I'm a meteorologist. I've been working alone at a monitoring station on top of a mountain, far from civilization, for quite some time. The station is old, isolated, and the only company I have are the howling winds and the data I log every day. Even now, when I think about what happened, I have trouble believing it. It all started on one of those nights with a snowstorm. I was monitoring a storm that was approaching. The wind was howling outside with a force that seemed like it could tear the station apart. I was used to these conditions, so I didn't think twice about continuing my work. But when I looked out the window, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just the snow or the storm dominating the landscape. Something more was happening. I saw a silhouette. At first I thought it was just an illusion. Maybe fatigue was playing tricks on me, but no, the figure was there, standing in the middle of the ice. A woman. She was dressed in white, with a cloak that seemed to float with the wind. I thought, it must be someone lost, someone who got caught in the storm and came looking for help. But at the same time, a strange feeling took over me. It didn't seem normal. I decided to investigate, even though I knew going outside in that weather could be a death sentence. I put on my snow gear, grabbed my flashlight, and got ready to head out. On my way to the door, I heard something that made me stop. Soft knocks, like someone was trying to get my attention. I looked around, but there was nothing. The knocking came from inside, from the window on the side of the mountain. I hesitated for a second, but curiosity won. When I looked outside again, I saw the silhouette of the woman, even closer now, as if she was waiting for me. My heart raced. I was starting to feel really uncomfortable, like something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me, but then the noise started again. Soft laughter, almost inaudible, but it was there, the sound of a woman laughing in the storm. There was no one there. I knew that, and my mind began to panic. I was alone, so who could be laughing? I went to the station's archives, as if I were looking for an answer to what was happening. I don't know why, but something made me check the old records. That's when I found something curious. A woman named Margaret had disappeared there many years ago, during a storm just like the one I was facing. The story said she was with a group of explorers, but something went wrong. The group got lost in the storm, and not knowing what to do, they abandoned her. Margaret died alone in that storm, with no one to hear her, no one to help her. The story said that until someone recognized her presence, she would keep appearing, wandering in the snow. Her death would repeat itself forever. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But with every passing moment, the feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I felt that I was a part of something I couldn't escape. I looked out the window again. The woman was there, even closer now, her face visible. She didn't look human. There was something in her eyes, in her gaze, that made me freeze with fear. Her eyes were empty, as if the very void of the storm had manifested in them. I knew she wasn't real, but the fear consumed me in a way I couldn't explain. I tried turning off the station's lights and hiding, as if I could escape from it all. But as the lights went out, the sound of her laughter grew louder. The storm outside was furious, but inside the station, everything was silent except for the knocks and the laughter. I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what wasn't. In a panic, I ran to the emergency supplies cabinet. I grabbed a radio, trying to call for help, but no matter how much I tried, I couldn't get a signal. I was isolated, completely isolated, with that ghostly presence watching me. The feeling of desperation grew with every second, and deep down, I knew I couldn't escape. Whatever was out there, waiting for me, wouldn't let me go that easily. As I prepared to face whatever it was, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. Maybe Margaret had never left that place. Maybe she was the storm, the snow, everything that was happening. I started to understand. I was trapped in her cycle, in her never-ending repetition. She wanted to be recognized, and I was the only one who could do it. But that didn't mean she would set me free. When I looked out the window one last time, she was there. Even closer, more visible. She was staring at me with her empty eyes as if she had been waiting for me all along. I felt a deep chill run down my spine, something cold spreading through my body. And before I could do anything, the woman turned and vanished into the snow. The sound of the storm, the knocks and the laughter all disappeared with her, as if nothing had ever happened. The storm passed. The sky was clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Something I couldn't see, but that was always there. The cycle would continue until someone else recognized the presence of the woman in the wind. I never really understood what happened. Maybe I imagined it all, but if that's the case, why do I still feel her gaze on me? Maybe she's still waiting for someone to recognize her, someone who needs to hear her story. I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. And to this day, every time a storm comes, I feel like she's closer than ever.